Chapter 1. The water was a miracle. Ilara sank deeper, letting the impossible heat seep into bones that had been cold for 3 days. Steam ghosted around her, clinging to the dark pines and ancient moss-covered stones that formed a perfect circle around the spring. It was a secret place, a hidden blessing in the heart of the Blackwood. She had stumbled upon it by sheer, dumb luck, her flight from humiliation finally ending in this small, perfect sanctuary. She closed her eyes, letting the memory she'd been outrunning finally catch up. It played behind her eyelids in searing detail. The great hall of the Iron Fang pack, packed with the alphas and nobles of 3 territories. The weight of 100 pairs of eyes. She had stood on the dais beside Alpha Varys, her betrothed, her hands clammy in the ceremonial white dress that suddenly felt like a shroud. This was meant to be the culmination of her life, the joining of her declining Silverwood bloodline with his rising, powerful one. It had been a lie. "I reject this union," Varys's voice had boomed, the words striking her with physical force. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. Her father's face, beside the Iron Fang elders, went rigid with shock, then purple with rage. Varys had turned to her, his handsome face twisted into a sneer of contempt. He was playing to the crowd, to the powerful alphas whose respect he craved more than any mate. "The Silverwood line has grown thin. They offer me a withered branch, an omega with no fire, no fight. Her scent is of dust and rain, not of a true she-wolf. She is barren ground." He had leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that still carried to every corner of the silent hall. "I will not sully the Iron Fang blood with such weakness." Each word was a stone, building a wall of shame around her. Withered branch, barren ground. He had made her into a thing of pity and disgust in a matter of seconds. Her father had looked at her then, not with comfort, but with the same fury he might show a lame horse that had cost him a race. She was a failed investment, a public disgrace. She hadn't waited for the dismissal. She hadn't waited for her father to drag her away. While the hall was still caught in stunned silence, before the whispers could begin to hiss and curl around her, Ilara had turned and walked. Not ran. She had walked down the steps of the dais through the parted sea of shocked wolves, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the great wooden doors. She did not look back. Once outside, she had shifted, her smaller, silver-pelted wolf form melting into the shadows of the surrounding forest. And she had run. She ran until her paws bled, until her lungs burned, until the shame was a dull ache beneath the screaming agony of her muscles. She had run into the Blackwood, the one place no one dared to follow. The King's Wood, a place where trespassers were said to be hunted for sport by the Alpha King himself. It was a foolish, suicidal act, but the thought of facing her family, of living with the brand of rejected, was a fate worse than any death the Silent King could devise. Now, submerged in the healing warmth of the spring, the memory finally lost its sharpest edges. The water was washing it away, or at least soothing the wound. She leaned her head back against a smooth, warm stone, a real, genuine sigh of relief escaping her lips. For the first time in her life, no one was watching her, judging her, measuring her worth. She was just here, alone. The snap of a twig broke the spell. Her eyes flew open. Every muscle in her body went rigid. She wasn't alone. She scanned the dense line of ancient pines at the edge of the clearing. The steam made it difficult to see, but she could feel it, the weight of a gaze. It was heavy, ancient, and utterly without malice. That was the strangest part. It was simply there, a presence. Slowly, she sank lower into the water until only her head was above the surface. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. A trespasser. She was a trespasser on royal land, bathing in what was clearly a sacred, or at least private, place. The punishment for that was death. No trial, no questions. The Blackwood king was known for his unyielding enforcement of his laws. Then she saw him. He wasn't hiding. He was leaning against the trunk of a massive ironwood tree, partially obscured by the shadows and the rising mist. He was impossibly tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark, simple leathers that bore no adornment, save for a single silver clasp at his collar shaped like a snarling wolf's head. The royal sigil. King Theron, the alpha of alphas. Fear, cold and sharp, sliced through the comforting heat of the water. This was so much worse than being found by a patrol. This was the king himself. He hadn't called his guards. He hadn't shouted a warning. He was just watching her, his expression unreadable from this distance, his stillness more terrifying than any overt threat. It was the calm of a predator that knows its prey is already caught. Ilara's mind raced. Should she speak? Beg for forgiveness? Scramble out of the water and try to run, a foolish and insulting gesture? Every option felt like a mistake. He had likely been watching her for some time, enjoying her ignorance, a cat watching a mouse before the final pounce. She had to get out. She couldn't cower in the water like a frightened fish, drawing on the last dregs of the pride she'd clung to walking out of that great hall. She moved with deliberate slowness toward the edge of the spring where her tattered clothes lay. The water swirled around her, the only sound in the unnervingly silent clearing. She kept her eyes on him, a silent acknowledgement that she knew he was there, that she was at his mercy. He didn't move a muscle. His gaze followed her, intense and analytical. It wasn't lustful, and it wasn't angry. It was curious, as if she were a strange new species of flora he'd discovered in his woods. That unnerved her more than anything. She reached the edge of the pool, her hand hesitating over her discarded tunic. To retrieve it, she would have to expose herself more fully. The thought of standing naked before the silent, watching king was a new and profound form of humiliation. But there was no choice. Taking a deep breath, she rose from the water. The cool evening air was a shock against her wet skin. She refused to shiver, refused to cover herself with her hands. She met his gaze across the clearing, her own expression a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. I am Ilara, of the now shamed House of Silverwood. I am a rejected mate. I am a trespasser. But I am not an animal to be scared into submission. She reached for her tunic, her movements fluid and unhurried. As her fingers brushed the rough fabric, he finally moved. He pushed off from the tree, stepping out of the shadows and into the soft twilight of the clearing. The sheer scale of him was breathtaking. He was a warrior king, built of corded muscle and quiet authority. His face was hard, carved from granite, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw. His dark hair was tied back from his face, and his eyes, even from yards away, seemed to hold the deep, starless gray of a winter sky. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, a respectful distance away. He wasn't approaching to threaten or seize her. He was simply waiting. She pulled the tunic over her head, the damp fabric clinging uncomfortably to her skin. She fumbled with her worn leather breeches, her fingers suddenly clumsy. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. She expected him to speak, to pronounce her sentence. He did not. Finally dressed, she stood straight, her chin lifted, ready to accept her fate. She had survived public disgrace. She could survive a private execution. The king's deep voice finally broke the silence, and the words he spoke were so far from what she expected that her mind failed to comprehend them for a long moment. "The patrols will be serving the evening meal soon," he said, his tone a low, gravelly timbre. "You must be hungry." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. He tilted his head slightly, his gray eyes pinning her in place. "Come," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Dine with me." Chapter 2. The walk to the fortress was a silent one. Ilara followed a few paces behind the king, her bare feet padding softly on the mossy ground. The path was invisible to her, but he navigated the darkening woods with an effortless certainty. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He simply knew she was. The sheer, unshakable confidence of a true alpha king was a palpable force, pressing in on her from all sides. She had expected a dungeon. She had braced herself for chains and cold stone. Instead, he led her through a small, unassuming postern gate in a towering wall of black granite. The fortress, which she'd only seen from a distance as a jagged crown on the mountain, was as stark and severe up close. It was not a place of comfort or artistry. It was a bastion, a bulwark against the world, built for war and watchfulness. Inside, there was no grand welcome. A few guards clad in the same dark leathers as the king nodded silently as he passed, their eyes flickering to Ilara for a fraction of a second before returning to their duties. Their discipline was absolute. No whispers, no curious stares. A quiet, older she-wolf with silver-streaked hair met them in a torchlit corridor. She bowed her head to the king. "My lord." "Greta, see that our guest has rooms, and a change of clothes," he commanded, his voice echoing slightly in the stone hall. He glanced at Ilara's tattered, damp tunic. "Something warm." Without another word, he turned and strode away down a different corridor, his footsteps fading into the fortress's deep silence. He left her there, standing dripping and bewildered in the heart of his stronghold. The woman, Greta, looked her over with a calm, professional eye. There was no pity in her expression, but no hostility either. It was the same detached neutrality as the king. "Come," she said, her voice soft. The rooms she was given were simple, but immaculate. A bed with a thick fur blanket, a small hearth where a fire already crackled, and a basin of hot water. A plain wool dress and soft leather slippers were laid out on the bed. It was more luxury than she had known in her entire life, accustomed as she was to the threadbare austerity of her declining house. "The king dines in an hour," Greta said from the doorway. "I will return to guide you." Then she was gone, leaving Ilara alone with the crackling fire and the disorienting kindness. This had to be a trap, a game, a way to fatten up a lamb before the slaughter. Powerful alphas, in her experience, did nothing without a reason that served their own interests. Varys had courted her for a political alliance, then discarded her for a better one. Her father had raised her as a bargaining chip. King Theron was the most powerful of them all. His motives would be the most complex and self-serving. Perhaps he was keeping her as a hostage, a pawn to use against her family, or Varys. The thought that they might actually have to bargain for her, the rejected Omega, was grimly amusing. When Greta returned, Ilara was dressed in the warm brown wool, her damp hair combed out with her fingers. She felt presentable, human. It was a strange sensation after days of being a hunted animal. The dining hall was as severe as the rest of the fortress. A long, dark wood table sat before a cavernous fireplace where an entire log blazed. There were no tapestries, no gilded plates, only polished wood, iron fixtures, and the two of them. The king sat at the head of the table, a flagon of wine before him. He gestured to the seat on his right. Servants moved with the same silent efficiency as the guards, placing platters of roasted meat, dark bread, and root vegetables on the table. They filled her plate and a goblet with water before retreating into the shadows. The king ate. He did not speak, did not look at her, but she felt his awareness of her in every breath she took. She picked at her food, her stomach a tight knot of anxiety. The silence was a weapon, and he wielded it with expert precision. Finally, when she thought she might break from the sheer tension of it, he spoke. "Why were you in my forest?" His voice was quiet, but it cut through the silence like a blade. She swallowed the piece of bread in her mouth. She had to choose her words carefully. "I was lost, my lord." "Wolves are not often lost in their own territories," he stated, tearing a piece of meat with his fingers. He still hadn't looked at her. "I was far from my territory." He finally turned his head, and his gray eyes met hers. They were incredibly piercing, as if they could see the lies and evasions in her soul. "Who are you running from?" There it was, the direct, inescapable question. She couldn't lie. She had the sense that a lie, no matter how small, would be an unforgivable insult to this man. Honesty, even a partial one, was the only path. "I displeased my alpha," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "At a public ceremony. I brought shame to my pack." She kept her eyes on her plate, unable to bear his scrutiny. "Displeased him how?" he pressed, relentless. "He found me lacking." The word tasted like ash. He rejected the mating. A long silence followed. She risked a glance up. The king was staring into the fire, his jaw tight. A muscle worked in his cheek. He seemed to be contemplating her words, weighing them. She had confessed the deepest shame of her life to the most feared wolf on the continent. "The name of this alpha?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. "It does not matter, my lord. It is a closed matter." "Is it?" he mused, more to himself than to her. He fell silent again, and to her immense relief, he did not press her further on the subject. He seemed to accept her minimal answers. The rest of the meal passed in that same thick silence. When they were finished, he rose from the table. She stood as well, her hands clasped before her, waiting for her dismissal, for the guards to finally come and take her to her cell. Instead, he walked toward a small, withered plant sitting in a clay pot on the stone mantelpiece. Its leaves were brown and curled, the stem brittle. It looked utterly dead. He ran a finger along one of its desiccated leaves. "My mother placed this here," he said, his back to her. "A moon petal. They say it only blooms in the presence of a true heart. It has been like this for 30 years. He turned back to her, his gaze sweeping over her, analytical and intense. "The fortress gardens are barren. The soil is sour. Nothing has grown within these walls for a generation." He walked toward the door, pausing as he passed her. "You will tend them," he said. It wasn't a request. "Starting tomorrow. See what you can do." And then he was gone, leaving her with these dying plant and the strange, impossible command. It wasn't the work of a hostage. It was a chore, a menial task assigned to a servant. She was to be the king's gardener. The humiliation of it should have stung, but as she looked from the dead moon petal to the roaring fire, all she felt was a profound and terrifying confusion. Chapter 3. The gardens were a testament to despair. They occupied a large, stone-walled courtyard in the heart of the fortress, open to the sky but sheltered from the mountain winds. What should have been a place of life was a graveyard of dirt and stone. The earth was packed hard, gray and lifeless. A few skeletal remains of ancient rose bushes clung to the walls like withered claws. It was a plot of land that had given up. Alara saw it not as a punishment, but as a reprieve. Here, she was left alone. The guards on the battlements above never looked down. The servants never entered the courtyard. It was her own little patch of desolation, and for that, she was grateful. She started small. She found a rusty spade and a pick in a forgotten shed and began the back-breaking work of turning the soil. The ground was as hard as rock, fighting her every inch of the way. For days, she did nothing but break the earth, her muscles screaming, her hands blistering, and then callousing over. She worked from dawn until dusk, collapsing into her bed each night in a state of pure physical exhaustion that left no room for shame or fear. Slowly, she began to feel something stirring, not just in the soil, but in herself. As she worked, she would let her senses sink into the ground beneath her. It was a thing she had always been able to do, a quiet, secret connection she never spoke of. Her family had considered it a useless, passive quirk, an Omega's trick. Varys would have laughed at it. But here, alone, she let it flow. She could feel the deep, dormant misery of the earth. It was tired, leeched of life, starved for generations. So she began to feed it, not with water or manure, but with something of herself. As she crumbled the clods of dirt in her hands, she pushed a thread of her own quiet energy into them. A silent plea, a gentle coaxing. She hummed old, forgotten songs of planting and harvest, her voice a soft murmur in the empty courtyard. The king never came to the garden, but she often felt his eyes on her. From the high, narrow window of the royal solar that overlooked the courtyard, she would sometimes catch a glimpse of his silhouette, a dark, unmoving shape watching her toil. She still believed he was watching for signs of treachery, or perhaps waiting for her to fail, to give up on the impossible task he had set her. His silent observation was a constant pressure, a reminder that she was a prisoner, no matter how comfortable her cage. Weeks turned into a month. The first sign of change was subtle. The soil, once a pale, dusty gray, began to darken to a rich, loamy black. It softened under her hands, becoming pliable and welcoming. Then, one morning, she saw it. A tiny speck of green. A single, determined sprout pushing its way toward the sun. She knelt, tears welling in her eyes. It wasn't a weed. She could feel the life pulsing from it, a clean, strong energy. She cupped her hands around it, whispering words of encouragement, feeding it a little more of her own essence. After that, the garden exploded with impossible life, not with common flowers or vegetables, but with plants no one had seen in the Blackwood for a century. Silver-leafed herbs with healing properties, night-blooming vines that coiled up the stone walls and produced blossoms that glowed with a soft, internal light. And in the very center of the garden, where she had focused most of her energy, a single, perfect moon-petal plant began to grow, its leaves the color of deep twilight, a tight bud nestled at its heart. The fortress staff began to whisper. Servants would find excuses to pass the archway that led to the courtyard, stealing glances at the miraculous transformation. They spoke of her in hushed, awed tones. The garden witch, the Omega who could command life. Ilara ignored them. She lost herself in her work, in the vibrant, breathing world she was creating. Here, surrounded by the life that answered her call, she wasn't a rejected mate or a shamed noble. She was herself. For the first time, she felt a flicker of something that might have been power. Not the loud, aggressive power of an alpha, but a quiet, persistent strength, the power to create rather than destroy. The outside world intruded on a storm-lashed afternoon. Greta came to the garden, her face grim. "The king requires your presence," she said, her usual calm replaced by a nervous tension. Ilara followed her to the throne room. It was a vast, intimidating chamber, the king's throne carved from the same black granite as the mountain itself. Theron sat upon it, not lounging, but perched like a hawk on its eyrie. Several of his guards stood at attention by the doors. He held a scroll in his hand, his knuckles white. "I have received a petition," he said, his voice flat and cold. He did not invite her to approach. She stood just inside the doorway, feeling small and exposed. "It is from Alpha Varus of the Iron Fang, supported by Lord Valerius of the Silverwood." Her father's name was a blow to the gut. She swayed slightly. "They claim a member of their pack, a flighty, unstable Omega, fled after stealing valuable heirlooms. They describe her as a troubled soul who requires firm guidance. They have tracked her to my borders and humbly request that I return their lost property to them for correction." He let the silence hang in the air, the insulting words echoing in the vast space. Lost property. That's all she was to them. An inconvenient, embarrassing piece of property they now wanted back. Not because they missed her, but because her presence in the Blackwood was a loose end, a threat to their carefully constructed narrative of her unworthiness. Theron's gray eyes were chips of ice. "They believe you are hiding somewhere in the villages along my border. They do not know you are within these walls." He looked at her then, a long, searching look. For the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than cold command in his eyes. It was a deep, simmering anger, and it wasn't directed at her. "Varus and your father are 2 days' ride from here," he said. "They seek an audience to formally present their claim. Tell me, Ilara of Silverwood, did you steal from them?" "No, my lord," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I took nothing but the clothes I wore." "Then they are liars," he said, as if it were the simplest, most obvious fact in the world. He rolled up the scroll, his movements precise and deliberate. "And I do not suffer liars in my kingdom." He rose from the throne. "They will have their audience, and you will be present." Chapter 4. Theron. He stood at the solar window watching her, the woman in the garden. He had been watching her for weeks. At first, it had been a matter of security. She was an unknown quantity, a stray who had breached his defenses and found his most private sanctuary. He had felt her presence at the spring long before he saw her, a soft, wounded energy that was utterly alien in his harsh, unforgiving lands. When he had finally revealed himself, he had expected fear, begging, hysterics. He had received none of it. She had met his eyes with a shattered but unyielding pride that had intrigued him. She had risen from the water, vulnerable and exposed, yet she had not cowered. In that moment, he knew she was no common runaway. The story she told him at dinner was threadbare, but he had sensed the truth woven through it. "He found me lacking." The words were heavy, with a pain so profound it had resonated in the cold stone of his hall. He knew the petty cruelties of the lesser alphas, their political matings and their fragile egos. He could picture the scene perfectly. Some arrogant young buck like Varys of Ironfang, making a public spectacle of rejecting her to enhance his own reputation. It was a coward's act, and it disgusted him. Giving her the garden had been an impulse, a test. The legends of his people spoke of the Earthsingers, of those whose blood ran with the life of the soil itself. His own grandmother was said to have been one, but the gift had faded from their line, leaving them with only the cold, hard strength of the mountain. His fortress, his lands, were strong, but they were barren. He ruled a kingdom of stone and shadow. He had watched Alara bring life back to the dead earth. He saw the way she touched the soil, the way she hummed to the seeds. He felt the shift in the very air of the courtyard, a subtle greening, a softening. The magic was not in her hands, but in her spirit. It flowed from her, not as an act of will, but as an extension of her very being. The life in the garden was a reflection of the life she kept so carefully hidden within herself. She was not barren ground. She was the most fertile soul he had ever encountered. The petition from Varys and her father was a vile piece of political maneuvering. Lost property, unstable Omega, thief. The lies were so transparent, so insulting, that they amounted to a challenge. They thought him a fool, a brutish recluse who could be easily placated with false humility and legalistic nonsense. They had no idea what or who they were asking for. They wanted to put her in chains, to correct her. They wanted to break that quiet, resilient spirit he had seen at the spring. They wanted to take this impossible, miraculous life-giver and crush her back into the box of their own making. He would sooner burn his kingdom to the ground. He felt a primal, possessive rage building in his chest, an instinct so strong it startled him. For 30 years, he had ruled alone, trusted no one, felt nothing but the weight of his crown. He had been a king of stone, ruling a fortress of stone. This woman, with her gentle hands and her secret, world-altering power, had planted a seed in the barren ground of his own heart. He would not allow anyone to rip it out. Alara. The gates of the fortress groaned open. 2 figures on horseback rode into the main courtyard, flanked by a small honor guard of Theron's wolves. Alpha Varys sat tall in his saddle, his armor polished to a mirror sheen, his expression arrogant and impatient. Beside him, her father, Lord Valerius, looked smaller, his face a mask of anxious severity. Theron stood on the top step of the keep, a silent, imposing figure. He had bid her to stand, not behind him, but beside him, a half step back. The position was one of significance, and she could see the flicker of confusion and anger in Varys's eyes as he took in the scene. He had expected to find a shivering, captured runaway, not a woman standing beside the Alpha King himself. They dismounted. Varys strode forward, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. He was used to commanding every space he entered. "King Theron," he began, his voice overly loud in the quiet courtyard. "We thank you for granting us an audience. We have come for our property, the Omega, Alara, of the disgraced House of Silverwood." He gestured dismissively in her direction, not even deigning to look at her. Theron remained perfectly still. "You have come on the basis of a lie," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the deadly weight of the mountain itself. "There is no thief here." Varys's face hardened. "She is an oath-breaker and a runaway. She belongs to her father, and by extension, to me, to face judgment for the dishonor she has brought us. She is a Silverwood problem, She is in the Blackwood now, Theron replied, his voice dropping even lower, colder. That makes her a Blackwood concern. She is under my protection. A collective intake of breath came from the guards and the petitioners. It was a declaration, a line drawn in stone. Varys's arrogance finally cracked, revealing the raw fury beneath. Your protection. She is a worthless barren Omega, a rejected mate. You would risk a dispute with 2 packs for that? He finally turned his venomous gaze on Ilara. Her father stepped forward, his expression pleading. My Lord King, she is my daughter. She must be disciplined. Allow us to take her home. This is her home now, Theron stated. The words were final. An edict. Varys lost control. His pride, his ambition, his entire sense of self was being challenged by a king he secretly thought a savage, all over a woman he had thrown away. His eyes blazed with fury, and he drew on the deepest well of his power. He directed his alpha command not at Theron, a suicidal move, but at Ilara. Kneel, he snarled, the word imbued with a power that could force a lesser wolf to their knees, whimpering in submission. The command hit Ilara like a physical blow. It was designed to shatter her will, to humiliate her in front of everyone, to prove her weakness. Her knees buckled instinctively. The force of it was immense, a wave of pure dominance seeking to drown her. But as she fell, something else rose up to meet it. It was the quiet, green energy she had poured into the garden. It surged up from the soles of her feet, a wellspring of deep, ancient power. It wasn't violent or aggressive. It was life. It was the unyielding strength of a root-splitting stone, the irresistible force of a forest growing toward the sun. The Alpha Command, built on rage and dominance, shattered against it. A visible pulse of soft, green light emanated from her. It was faint, like heat haze, but everyone saw it. But everyone, the stone flags at her feet, barren for a century, suddenly sprouted a carpet of lush, emerald green moss, glowing with a faint luminescence. The dead ivy clinging to the walls of the keep instantly burst into leaf, unfurling in a wave of impossible green that raced up the stone. The courtyard was silent, save for the collective gasp of the onlookers. Varys stared, his mouth agape, his alpha command broken and useless. He looked from her to the impossible life blooming on the stone and back again, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. He had rejected this. He had called this barren ground. Her father looked like he had seen a ghost. Ilara stood straight, the green light fading around her, leaving the scent of fresh rain and rich soil in the air. She was breathing heavily, not from exertion, but from the shock of her own unleashed power. She felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Theron. He had moved to stand directly beside her, his presence a solid, unshakable wall. He wasn't shocked. He wasn't surprised. His gray eyes held a look of profound, absolute confirmation, as if he had been waiting for this all along. He looked down at Varys, his expression one of utter contempt. Leave my lands, the Alpha King commanded. And his voice held the power of the mountain, the forest, and the very stone beneath their feet. Chapter 5. Varys and her father did not need to be told twice. They scrambled onto their horses, their faces pale with a mixture of fear and profound humiliation, and fled the courtyard without a backward glance. The great gates of the fortress boomed shut behind them, the sound a final, definitive judgment. The courtyard was still filled with the impossible green. The guards stared, their stoic discipline broken by sheer awe. Theron's hand was still on her shoulder, a warm, grounding weight. He turned her gently away from the gawking soldiers and guided her back into the keep, his hand moving to the small of her back. The gesture was possessive, protective, and sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with fear. He led her, not to the throne room or her own chambers, but up a winding stair to his private solar. It was a starkly masculine room, dominated by a massive oak desk covered in maps and a fireplace large enough to stand in. The only softness came from the thick furs thrown over the chairs, and on the mantelpiece, the potted moon-petal plant she had seen on her first night was no longer withered. Its leaves were a deep, healthy twilight blue, and the central bud had swollen on the verge of blooming. He walked over to it, touching a leaf with a reverence she had not thought him capable of. My grandmother